This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
So I'm going to talk about the positive notion of mental health, or the positive conception of mental health. It seems to me that the way that we talk about mental health has changed a lot just in the last 10 years or so. When people talk about well, first of all, people talk a lot more about mental health, it seems to me. Certainly my students talk about their mental health a lot. At work, we have mental health programs and mental health awareness weeks and months. My friends are far more likely than I ever remember them being to say things like, I think that I need a holiday for the sake of my mental health, or I'm taking a mental health day off work. So mental health is talked about more often, but also the way that it's talked about, I think, has changed. When people talk about being mentally healthy now, increasingly they're not talking about just being free of mental illness. It's not as though being mentally healthy just means not suffering from depression, not suffering from anxiety or bipolar or whatever else. Instead, mental health is being held out as a kind of reasonably determinate, attractive, good state to attain. The sort of thought is that if you're mentally healthy, then there are certain things that you feel and certain things that you can do which we can describe at a reasonably detailed level. So, for example, if you imagine someone who's enjoying good mental health, you might imagine someone who feels relaxed most of the time, who is able to make decisions under pressure, who doesn't feel too much stress, who has positive relationships and behaves well within them, who's able to make plans and carry them out, and so on and so on. So we sort of have this conception more and more of being mentally healthy as some particular state over and above simply being free of mental illness. Now, when mental health is discussed in the public policy world, and also in the kind of popular press, when people talk about mindfulness and meditation and so on as things that can contribute to mental health, in the positive psychology literature, which some of you may know, which is concerned with promoting mental health and well-being, they talk a lot about the kinds of things that contribute to mental health, but don't talk a lot about what mental health actually is. And it seems to me that this is an area, when we think about the positive conception of mental health, in which practice has got quite a long way ahead of theory. So it seems to me that if you look at the different kinds of things that people say about what mental health is across different fields and in different kinds of media outlets and so on, what they say are things that are often very different, very, very vague. And this is a problem, I think, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, and without wanting to argue for it, I'll just say I think a lot of what is said about what contributes to mental health is dangerous. Often people talk about a state as being a state of mental health as a way of covering up certain political or moral or other sorts of standards that they're trying to impose under the label of mental health. But also, there's a fairly venerable, respectable line of thinking that suggests that it's just a great big mistake to think of the mind as something that can be healthy. Applying the category of health to the mind, according to many, as we'll see, is just a mistake. So I think it's a problem that we don't have a better theoretical understanding of positive mental health. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to sketch a way in which you can consider mental health to be real and to be important, while also paying tribute to some of the concerns that I and other people have about the sort of discourse that surrounds mental health at the moment. So that's kind of where I'm headed. My argument has to this extent I have an argument, it has a kind of funny structure. What I want to do is to show that there's a sense in which we have a right to mental health, but if we have a right to mental health, then mental health has to be a particular kind of thing. But it's also quite plausible to think that mental health is that kind of thing, and therefore it's quite plausible to think we have a right to mental health. So it's sort of a circular argument, but hopefully in a nice kind of circular way. To kind of warm you up and to give you a sense of the territory, I want to run through 4 different views about mental health. 3 of them are theories of mental health, and the 4th one argues that we ought not to have a theory of mental health. Now, some of these are theories that are explicitly defended in particular parts of the literature. Others you have to kind of draw from the literature by creatively reading what people have said about mental health. But I still maintain that they're all out there. So here's the first theory. This is evolutionary functionalism. And the view is that to have a healthy mind is to have a mind that functions in the way that it was selected to function. So we're used to thinking that different parts of the body have evolutionary histories. So there's a reason why we have eyes. And the reason why we have eyes is that eyes serve a certain purpose. They do something for us, and when an eye is healthy, arguably, it's doing what it was selected to do. Similarly for other parts of the body. And the suggestion that this theory makes is that we can understand the mind in the same way. The mind is made up of parts, and those parts are there, you know, because they were selected for over evolutionary history. So for example, we might have a flight or fight mechanism. Maybe that's one part of your mind. Why does it exist? Well, because it was evolutionarily advantageous to develop the flight or fight mechanism. How do we know if it's working well? Well, depending on whether, you know, it tends us to want to stand up and fight versus running away at about the right times. What else? We have sleep cycles. That's a kind of a part of an aspect of our mind that we feel tired at times. When's it working well? Well, when it makes us tired at about the right times and causes us to get about the right amount of sleep. And so on. We have emotions, we have belief-forming capacities, and all of these, I suppose, have evolutionary histories. One advantage of this view, and this view is very popular, almost to the point of being taken for granted in some areas of philosophy of medicine. One advantage of it is that it's closely analogous to probably the most well-known view about the nature of physical health, which is that to be physically healthy is to have a body whose parts function in the way that they're intended to function, where the story about how they're intended to function is normally an evolutionary story. But it's not a very plausible theory of mental health for a couple of reasons. First of all, there just seems to be no guarantee that our minds were selected to be healthy. There's no particular reason to think that being calm and well-adjusted and happy and being able to make good decisions and being relaxed is evolutionarily advantageous. We were probably selected to be angry, to have bad tempers, to get grumpy, to get stressed. All of these are parts of the human mind that's evolved just as much as anything else is. It's not clear that if evolution is selecting for reproductive success, then it'll select people who are, you know, Zen-like all of the time. And the other problem is that it's actually quite difficult, as I understand it, to isolate different parts of the mind in the way that it is possible to isolate different parts of the body. So you can talk about the evolutionary history of the heart in a way that's far more precise and easier to understand than any prospect of talking about the evolutionary history of, for example, I don't know, beliefs about the external world, or guilt, or irritability. All the things that we think of as parts of the mind don't have any clear correspondence to a particular mapping that maps out the bits of the mind and says where they come from. So the project of telling an evolutionary story about the different parts of the mind and having that story come out in such a way that we think that the mind was selected for mental health seems like a very, very difficult and, you know, probably unachievable kind of goal. This has been well known for a long time, and in response to those kinds of concerns, partially, there is a movement which has its roots in people like Thomas Sartz and Michel Foucault, that says that it's simply a mistake to apply the category of health and perhaps also the categories of disease and illness and disorder to the mind. And the basic argument is that the mind doesn't have the kind of function that the body has. It's just not clear what emotions are for or what beliefs are for, and so on. And because it doesn't have that kind of function which can be naturalistically described, it's just a mistake to say that a mind is something that can be healthy or sick. So people in this movement, the anti-psychiatry movement, tell us that instead of talking about diseased or healthy minds, we should talk either about diseased or healthy brains, or we should just not use that language at all. Instead, we should just talk about the things we care about, like a mind that is happy, or that flourishes, or that is facing problems. Or we should just use kind of ethical language to describe the mind. Health language is reserved for the body and for the brain. So anyway, that's the view that I think of as a kind of fallback option. If we really can't make sense of the notion of mental health, then maybe we have to fall back on the view that that's because you just can't profitably apply the category of health to the mind. There's another functionalist story about mental health, which has its roots, arguably, in Aristotle. Certainly that's where people take inspiration for this view. And this one's a little bit harder to find explicitly stated in the literature, but I think is there. And this is the view that, yes, the mind does have a function, but its function is quite different from the body. The function of the mind is to think, and the mind is healthy insofar as it is thinking well. So on the Aristotelian picture of mental health, this is not something that Aristotle himself ever said, but it's ascribed, it's said by people who are inspired by Aristotle. A mind that's healthy is a mind that's rational. And to the extent that you are enjoying mental health, you think things for the right reasons, you do things for the right reasons, you form beliefs based on the evidence, you act in ways that are sort of, I don't know, prudential and moral and maybe beautiful and that makes sense. So to have a healthy mind is to do the mental stuff, thinking, deciding and acting in a way that's responsive to reasons. And this is an attractive view in many ways, but I think its drawback is that it turns out pretty quickly to be circular. It's very hard to get anything very determinate out of the rationalist view of mental health. So just to give one example, one question that you might ask if you're thinking about mental health is, for how long is it healthy to grieve? So after a loved one has died, presumably it's perfectly natural and perfectly healthy to be sad for a while, but not perfectly natural and healthy to be sad decades later, still to be grieving over the death of your loved one. So what counts as a healthy period to grieve? And this is a question that's obviously an important practical question, and one that's confronted when people try to give new definitions of depression, for example. Well, what's the answer? On the rationalist view, it's healthy to grieve for as long as you have good reason to grieve. But for how long do I have good reason to grieve? Well, the answer, it seems to be, is, well, for as long as grieving, you have good reason to grieve for a certain period of time, insofar as grieving for that period of time contributes to your flourishing or to your virtue or to your living a good life or whatever else you take reasons to be grounded in. But that sounds like just another way of saying that you should grieve for as long as it's healthy to grieve, and then you should get over it. So anyway, that's one example, and those examples come up over and over, in which the rationalist picture of mental health, the idea that having a healthy mind is a matter of responding properly to the reasons, turns out to be circular when it comes to the questions that we might hope it to answer. The fourth view about mental health, and this is the one that you will find if you do an internet search, this is the one that's captured in the World Health Organization definition of mental health, and overwhelmingly present in the definitions of mental health that are given by public health bodies. And this is the view that mental health is well-being. So the World Health Organization says that to be mentally healthy is, and I won't remember the words, but it's along the lines of, to be mentally healthy is to live a life that is full of well-being. And that means being well-adjusted, having personal relationships, working, contributing to your community, feeling safe and secure, and realizing all of your potential. That's what it is to be mentally healthy. So this corresponds roughly, I suppose, to the philosophical notion of well-being. To have mental health is just to have your life going well in every possible respect. Everything's great. The problem with that view, I mean, it's just obviously false, isn't it? Even if the United Nations says it's true. It seems pretty obvious that you can have an awful life, a life low in well-being, even though you've got perfect mental health. So for example, if your family has all been killed in a car accident and you've lost your job, but it's not your fault, and you're really sick and you've just been thrown in jail, you don't have a high level of well-being. But you might be perfectly mentally healthy. You know, you might respond to all of those events in perfectly healthy ways. There's no guarantee that just because you're miserable and just because you've had terrible luck, you'll have low mental health. Your problem is that life's treated you really badly. It's not that you have a health issue. Conversely, it seems possible for there to be people who have very high levels of well-being but very poor mental health. So for example, people who suffer from bipolar disorder, if they have very good support and good medication, can really live fantastic lives, lives that are no worse than anything that you or I or anyone else would aspire to. And yet they don't have great mental health. They have bipolar disorder and they need continued treatment and medication. If you're not convinced by that case, I mean, imagine someone who is an alcoholic. Now, alcoholism is a mental health condition. It's normally treated in that way. Someone can be a recovering alcoholic, and because they're an alcoholic, they can't go out to places where there is alcohol present. They can't stay up late at night because it's too dangerous. There's too much danger that they'll relapse. They have to spend a lot of time going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and seeing their therapist and so on. But you could be in that position and it could be fantastic. Maybe you really enjoy going to AA meetings and you get a real sense of solidarity and fun. And maybe having to go to bed early and stay away from bars is actually really good for you. You know, you stay home and you get proper sleep and you get some work done. Getting up early and exercising, is a way of fighting your addiction, but it also turns out to be really enjoyable. Anyway, this is no guarantee that just because you're fighting against a serious mental health problem, you'll be miserable. It's possible to have a high level of well-being and yet a low level of mental health. So, the identification of mental health with well-being seems to me just a flat-out mistake. So I reckon that we need a new theory of mental health if we are to treat positive mental health as something that's real and that can be valued. And by way of trying to come up with that theory, I want to start by talking about the kind of political significance that mental health might be held to hold. The paper is called A Right to Mental Health. And when I talk about a right to mental health, I'm thinking of the following kind of right. The sort of right that you have to something when distributive justice requires that you get it. So a right of the sort that I'm talking about is a right of distributive justice. Distributive justice is the topic of how resources or how things ought to be distributed within a community so as to achieve justice. So you might be an egalitarian, you might think that distributive justice requires equality, you might be a utilitarian, you might just think it requires as much good stuff as possible, you might be you might have a maxi-min theory, so justice is achieved when the person who has the least has as much as possible. But whatever your theory is, that's what a theory of justice can look like. And in order to fill out your theory of justice, you need to have a view about what kind of thing we're trying to distribute, or what kind of good is the one that we ought to be paying attention to when we try to make our society just. In the literature, the kinds of goods that are taken to be important for distributive justice are things like nutrition, education, shelter, health. The idea being that you can tell whether a society is just by asking how many people get a decent education, how healthy people are, how many people have enough food, how many people are sheltered from the elements, how many people have decent clothing, how many people are able to work, those kinds of things. And at a theoretical level, different philosophers have offered different kinds of interpretations of the sort of good that we are focused on when we're focused on those sorts of things. And if I can just say a little bit about how the debate works out, that might be helpful. You could start by thinking that what we want in order for society to be just is to achieve a certain distribution of happiness or well-being, perhaps. So you might say society is just when everybody's as happy as possible, or when everybody's equally happy, or when the least happy person is as happy as possible. But that's not very plausible. Firstly, because it just doesn't seem, it seems a bit kind of frightening, almost, to imagine that government or the rest of the community should be taking an interest in our levels of happiness. Does that mean that in order to achieve a just society, we need a government that makes sure that our marriages are going well, or that we are spending our time, I don't know, surfing rather than on our iPhones, if surfing turns out to give us more happiness? So thinking about distributive justice as something that's concerned with people's levels of happiness seems to allow distributive justice to be more intrusive than we might hope. But the real problem is that often our levels of happiness, our level of happiness is really just up to us. It's not anybody else's problem. So if I get myself into a position whereby I just can't be happy in the evening unless I have a really expensive glass of red wine with my dinner, that doesn't mean that you all now have an obligation to make sure that I have that glass of red wine. That's my problem, not yours. Similarly, if I'm just someone who tends to get down, no matter how much you give me, that's my problem, not yours. It doesn't seem to be a matter of justice that the government or the community gives me everything that I need to be happy. So anyway, in response to concerns like that, people have offered other ways of thinking about, as they call it, the metric or the currency of distributive justice. Distributive justice is often taken to be concerned with the distribution of, for example, capabilities, where the thought is that you don't need to make people happy, but what you do need to do is to give them certain capabilities. For example, the ability to be well nourished, the ability to move around, the capability to have good health, these sorts of things. Others have talked about primary goods, where a primary good is something that will be useful to you pretty much regardless of what kind of life you choose to live. Others have talked about resources or access to advantage or other sorts of terms as well. Now, these sorts of concerns are supposed to kind of focus our attention on the sorts of goods that are important for pretty much everybody and whose distribution is partly socially determined. So, for example, the reason why nutrition is so important when we're thinking about distributive justice is that it doesn't really matter what kind of life you live. Whether you want to be a surfer or a philosopher or a priest or an architect or whatever, you're going to need adequate nutrition. You're going to need decent food. Also, nutrition, as we know, is something whose distribution is controlled often by patterns of exploitation and poverty and structures of power. So whether you have enough food is not usually, if you don't have enough food, it's not usually your fault. It's usually partly reflective of the way in which social structures change people's lives in your society. And those are reasons to think that, nutrition, for example, and as well as other capabilities and resources, is a concern of distributive justice, and therefore something that the government or your community ought to try to give you insofar as it can. There are some other complications to do with the debate about distributive justice, but maybe I'll skip over them. We can come back to them in the question period if you want. I guess that what I'd like to do, if you find all of that plausible, is to say that it makes it fairly easy to see why mental health would be considered something that also ought to be a concern of distributive justice. Put it this way, your mental health has the same kind of effect on your ability to live the good life that you choose as does being nourished or being educated or having shelter. So, for example, if you suffer from very poor impulse control, then that can be something that makes it very difficult for you to live a good life, whether the good life that you want is a life of surfing or doing philosophy or being an architect or something else. If you are unable to form close personal relationships because you don't have the psychological resources to do so, then that again will be a barrier to your living a good life, pretty much regardless of what sort of life you want to live. Furthermore, as we now know, mental health outcomes are partially socially determined. Poverty is associated with stress and anxiety, and often such things as poor impulse control and poor levels of concentration. Groups that are recognised as oppressed for other reasons, whether ethnic groups, groups defined by gender or sexuality, suffer predictably from worse mental health than others. So mental health seems to be one of these things that's very important in enabling people to live decent autonomous lives, and also whose distribution is partly determined by the kind of power structures that exist in a society. Also, I mean, physical health is often taken as the kind of paradigm thing that broadly egalitarian people who have a concern with distributive justice care about. So one of the goals of a society that's aiming to distribute resources in a just way is to have a decent public healthcare system. A healthcare system where no one has to die of easily preventable diseases, and so on. But it's hard to see why you could have good reason for thinking that physical health ought to be a concern of distributive justice if mental health is not. After all, if somebody has an accident, the post-traumatic stress disorder they suffer can be just as debilitating and just as painful and last just as long as the physical injuries that they suffer. If we're thinking about people's quality of life, then trying to help them with mental health issues is just as important as trying to help them with physical health issues. So for all of those reasons, I reckon that there's at least a prima facie case for thinking that insofar as we're concerned about distributive justice, we should be concerned about people's levels of mental health, which is to say that since we're talking about justice, we should think that there's a sense in which people have a right to mental health. Now, saying that you have a right to mental health in this sense doesn't mean that you'll automatically, get it. Rights of distributive justice aren't the only concerns that governments and communities need to pay attention to. Maybe it has to be weighed up against other concerns. Whether the government is able to provide you with mental health, whether it has the resources to do so, is always another question. And also, as with all of these other goods, mental health is not something that can be handed to you. It's not like a croissant or something. What you can be given is the resources that are necessary for you to achieve good mental health. And they might be things like decent working conditions, a city to live in that's not completely depressing all the time, mental health care when you need it, and so on. So when we talk about providing people with mental health, in this context, people having a right to mental health, what we're really doing is talking about providing the basis for mental health, such that if people choose not to take advantage of the resources they're given, then that's their problem. But if they do take advantage of them, then they ought to have good levels of mental health. In just the same way that when we talk about a right to nutrition, you can't force anybody to eat. You can give them food, but you can't force them to eat. So you're really talking about a right to all of the things that enable somebody to be nourished. Now, if you're going to accept my claim that there's reason offhand to think that we have a right to mental health, then you should start to wonder about what mental health could be such that we have a right to it. I've given reasons to think that we probably don't have a right to happiness or well-being. So therefore, mental health can't be happiness or well-being. It's got to be something else. Could it be that we have a right of distributive justice to have minds that do what evolution intended them to do? It seems to me like that would be a bit of a funny result. But here's something that we could conceivably have a right to. Suppose that we think about the value of mental health by analogy with the value of physical health. I've said that the two things are different in certain ways, but here's one way in which I think that they're similar. Being physically healthy is valuable because it allows you to do lots of really, really good things. So, for example, if you're physically healthy, then you can study more effectively. If, for example, you're not in pain, you're not coughing, and you're not tired all the time because you don't have a physical health problem, then it's easier to study. Similarly, if you want to travel, if you want to have a family, if you want to go out and socialise, you want to produce great art, whatever great thing it is that you want to do, it's usually easier to do if you're physically healthy. Diseases, sicknesses and disorders tend to get in the way of those sorts of activities in life. But that said, being physically healthy doesn't guarantee that you'll live a good life or that you'll do anything valuable. You could be physically healthy and yet just sit and eat chips all day, and feel miserable. It's quite possible. And in fact, being physically healthy can enable you to do lots of stupid things as well. So if you have the goal of, banging your head against the wall 500 times, that takes some stamina and strength. So you're probably better able to do it if you're physically healthy. So it seems to me that physical health is very valuable, but it's instrumentally valuable. It's valuable because of what it can produce. And the fact that you're physically healthy doesn't guarantee that anything good will come of your life. It makes it more likely, but it doesn't guarantee it. And it can in fact enable you to do some things that are not very desirable too. Now, mental health, I think plausibly, plays the same kind of role. If you are in a state that we kind of might intuitively recognise as one of involving positive mental health, if you have a good level of concentration, you're generally relaxed, you don't let things stress you out, you're good at making decisions under pressure, you're good at forming relationships, you have good impulse control, all these kinds of things, you have emotions at about the time when those emotions make sense, then it makes it easier for you to do things like studying and producing great art and doing your job and travelling and all the other good things in life. Having poor mental health is often experienced as a barrier, something that prevents you from doing the good things that you'd like to do. It prevents you from being a good friend, or it prevents you from being able to travel, or it prevents you from being able to make plans, or it prevents you from being able to put all your energy into the things that you enjoy doing. So mental health does have that kind of value. But in the same way as physical health, I think being mentally healthy can also make it a lot easier for you to do stupid things. So if you have made the decision that instead of banging your head against a brick wall, what you want to do is to, count all the blades of grass on the football field. And that's what you decided to dedicate yourself to. Again, that takes a good memory, it takes a lot of concentration and perseverance, it takes real resilience and resolve. You've got to be quite mentally healthy in order to do that. And if that's your goal in life, it might be better for you if you weren't mentally healthy. Maybe if you ran out of concentration quickly, then you'd give up and go off and do something better than just counting blades of grass. So anyway, the point, and again, you can think of people who have lived, who have done dumb things with their life, have committed themselves to ridiculous projects and made themselves completely unhappy, who are only able to do that because they were so mentally healthy, because they had such conviction and perseverance and powers of concentration and the ability to make plans and follow them through, the ability to inspire others to come along with them, and so on. So for those reasons, I think it's independently plausible to think that mental health is of instrumental value. It's something that usually makes life a lot better, but not always, and there's no guarantee that it will. So being mentally healthy in and of itself doesn't seem to me valuable. It's valuable for what it allows you to do. And if that's right, then it becomes quite plausible to think that mental health plays the role in life that's also played by things like education and nutrition and shelter. the sorts of things that are taken to be the proper concerns of distributive justice. Why should people be given mental health? Because that's something that they will almost certainly need in order to live a decent life of whatever kind they choose. That's why it's plausible to think that mental health is something that we have a right to, but I think it also offers us the grounds for a definition of mental health. Why don't we just say that to be mentally healthy is to have the stable mental states, the dispositions, emotions, desires, beliefs, habits, and so on, that are such as to make a wide variety of good ways of living available. So that's my claim about what mental health is. You make the instrumental connection between living a good life and being mentally healthy a matter of definition. To be mentally healthy just is to have the kind of mind that makes it more likely that you'll be able to access any of a wide variety of good ways of living. Now, it's quite a vague definition, and as I'm going to say, I think there are lots of different ways in which it can be filled in, but that's my suggestion anyway. In order to add more details to that conception of mental health, we need to say something about what it means to live a decent or a good life. So here's what I think at a broad level we can say about the nature of a good life. Obviously, this is a hugely controversial question, and people have different views about what a good human life consists in, but here are some things I think we can say. A good human life consists in living happily, living ethically, and living with broadly true beliefs. So if you live your life unhappily, if you're unhappy in life, your life may be wonderful in all sorts of other ways, but it's not a fully good life. It'd be a better life if you were happy. If you live a life that's unethical, you might be very happy and you might have lots of success in other ways, but insofar as you're living immorally, you're not living a good life. And if you live a life that is utterly deluded, if you live a life in which you're perfectly happy, but you're wrong about the nature of the world around you, maybe the reason why you're happy is that you think you're God, but in fact you're not. Or maybe the reason why you're happy is you think that you're in a wonderful marriage, when in fact your partner is just laughing at you behind your back all the time. That's another respect in which you can fail to live a life that's as good as it could be. Within those restrictions, I think there are many, many different ways to live a good life, and many of them we probably can't even imagine. So I'm sure there are perfectly good lives available to people in hunter-gatherer societies tens of thousands of years ago that I can't even imagine. I couldn't even recognise them as good lives. But that says something about me, not about them. What kinds of good lives we can live is determined partly by human nature and partly by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So, for example, it might be that in the abstract, you could live a perfectly good life by sitting still and thinking about philosophy the whole time and being entirely alone. But if you're a human, then you won't be able to live that kind of life because humans are social creatures, so that's a kind of life that's not available to us. A life of utter benevolence in which you devote yourself completely to the interests of others might be, in the abstract, a good life, but it's not a life that's available to a human. You know, human nature just doesn't allow us to be completely 100% benevolent all the time. So what you think counts as a good human life is going to depend partly on what you think humans are capable of, what kind of limits we face by our natures. Also, as I said, what kinds of lives, good lives are available to you depends on your circumstances. You know, the good life of a Viking is going to be very different from the kinds of good lives that are available to us in 21st century Munich, and so on. If all of that is correct, then we should expect that people will disagree about what makes for a good life. If they disagree about what makes for a moral life, if they have metaphysical disagreements, you know, so people who think that there is a flying spaghetti monster will think that there is nothing wrong with a life dedicated to the flying spaghetti monster. People who think there isn't will think there is something wrong with that kind of life. People will also disagree about the nature of the good life based on their conceptions of human nature. We have different views about what humans are capable of, and also based upon their assessment of the kinds of surroundings that we find ourselves in. And in my opinion, those kinds of disagreements we should expect to be reflected in views about the nature of mental health. So, for example, whether you think that a monogamous life is the only kind of good life that you can live insofar as sex and relationships are concerned, then you will have a different view about what counts as mental health from someone else who thinks that there's nothing special about a monogamous life. If you think that having access to a good life necessarily means having access to a monogamous life, then you'll think that the kind of mind that counts as healthy is going to be different from the kind of mind that would be counted as healthy by someone who has no such scruples. And I think that these sorts of disagreements, as a matter of fact, are reflected, in the history of psychiatry and of thinking about mental health. Much of the debate about various conditions, like whether or not homosexuality ought to be counted as a mental disorder, whether atheism ought to be counted as a mental disorder, as it has been at times, and certainly whether certain sorts of behavioural patterns ought to be counted as mental disorders. So, for example, hyperactivity in children is regarded by some people as a sign of poor mental health, and by others as just children being children. Those are the kinds of disagreements that I think should be expected to arise under my conception of the nature of mental health, because they're basically disagreements about human nature, or about morality, or more generally, about what counts as a good human life. So to that extent, I take it that mental health is a kind of a moral concept, among other things. What you take to count as mental health is going to depend partly on what you take to count as good ways of living, and that's partly a moral question, and therefore whether you think people are equipped mentally to live good lives will depend partly on your moral views. So we should expect people with different moral views to disagree strongly about the nature of mental health. We should also expect people to make lots and lots of mistakes. So we know that throughout history, various humans have held absolutely horrible moral views. And probably some of the moral views that we hold now are horrible too. And because our conception of mental health reflects those moral views, we should be very cautious and kind of humble about imposing our views about the nature of mental health upon others. In the same way that, homosexuals were horribly treated for a long time because their homosexuality was construed as a mental illness. We may find that there are some things that we regard as mental health problems now that we regard as so only because we have mistaken moral views, not because we are sort of seeing through to the truth of the function of a healthy mind. Okay, so that's pretty much my view. I want to finish just by talking about a couple of little interesting implications or puzzles that arise from it, but I won't take very much longer. One question that I think is important to ask about the nature of mental health, and that is overlooked in a lot of the literature, is the question of whether mental health could be culturally or in other ways relative. On the one hand, it seems ridiculous to think that it could be. If we're talking about the health of the human mind, then surely a healthy mind just is a healthy mind, no matter where or when it's found. But on the other hand, it's quite easy to imagine, a Viking who was perfectly mentally healthy for a Viking, but who would quite rightly be put in an institution if they existed here and now. And it seems to me that we should say that while there are certain commonalities associated with human nature that will apply to conceptions of mental health regardless of time and place, it is going to turn out that mental health is relative. That is, what it takes to be a mentally healthy 25-year-old in Germany in a city today might be very different from what it took to be a mentally healthy 25-year-old on the savannah 30,000 years ago. So for example, whether you live in a literate society can make a big difference to what it takes to be mentally healthy. Somebody who is unable to learn to read or write or has real trouble doing so in our society really suffers in terms of their ability to access the kinds of good lives that are available to people around here. That's not true in a pre-literate society. The same will be true for things like having a visceral aversion to conflict. So I've certainly got this. As soon as it looks like there might be a fight, I just kind of run and hide. And I could never kill an animal, you know, with my hands, because I just have this terrible aversion to it. And for the most part, that doesn't, I mean, it may even help me around here. It stops me getting into as many fights. But if I had that on the savannah, you know, I would have been a terrible member of the tribe. Or if I had that in a society in which you're expected to stand up and fight for yourself, or else you'd be downtrodden, I probably wouldn't do so well. So, how your mind is set up when it comes to things like dealing with conflict can make a big difference to what kinds of lives are available to you if you live in one kind of society but not in another. So I think we should say that mental health can be culturally relative, and arguably that's another way in which it's different at quite a deep level from physical health. Finally, you know, so my view is that you have a lower level of mental health insofar as there are aspects of your mind that make it more difficult for you to get access to good ways of living in the conditions in which you find yourself. But one thing I need to do is to try to distinguish between the sorts of mental conditions that count as mental health problems and the sorts of mental conditions that count not as problems for you but as problems for your society. So for example, if you have the hyperactive child in a classroom, one way to deal with that issue is to say, well, we need to treat the child. The child has a health problem, we need to stop the child from being hyperactive. But another, and perhaps a better one, is to change the classroom situation, to change the way that children are taught so that they're not required to sit still for long periods of time. Similarly, if you are, you know, a homosexual person who's born into a terribly homophobic society, that can make a huge difference to your ability to live a good life. If you're not able to be open about your sexuality, if you are constantly in fear of being, you know, having violence perpetrated against you, if you feel like you can't be the person you really are openly, then that can be a way of being unable to live the kind of life that humans ought to be able to live. But I don't want to say that that means you have a mental health problem. What it means instead is that you're in a society that ought to change so as to allow for a greater variety of people to flourish in that society. So one question that remains, and that I think, you know, if I had to be defensive about it, I would say is a problem for other theories too, but certainly a problem for mine, is this question of how we distinguish between problems that are correctly conceptualized as mental health problems for the individual and problems that are better conceptualized as ethical or social problems for the community. And if anyone has any ideas about that, I'd be grateful. Okay, so I've done my best to try to make the view clear. The argument, as I said, is kind of roundabout. But what I hope to have shown is firstly that mental health is the kind of thing that ought to figure in discussions of distributive justice. We should, when thinking about how to organise a society and how to distribute resources, the goal of giving people decent levels of mental health should be up there, with the goal of giving them decent levels of education and nutrition and shelter and so on. And secondly, that mental health itself can be understood as a kind of resource. To have mental health is to have the kind of mind that enables you to have access to any of a variety of good human lives, such that whichever way you end up deciding to take your life, the fact that you're mentally healthy will make it easier for you to succeed. And that's what I got.